Welcome to EdTech Speaks, a podcast bringing guests together to share their expertise and advice on navigating business and education in a technology-driven world. From entrepreneurs to vendors, higher education to corporate leaders, we'll uncover their perspective regarding the latest trends and technologies impacting your career or business. Our podcast is made possible by Downing EdTech Consulting, where people and technology connect. Hosted by Cher Downing, an experienced executive spanning a higher education and corporate career with specific focus on the EdTech industry. Dr. Downing is also an international and national presenter, author, and regular media contributor. Now here is your host, EdTech strategist, Dr. Cher Downing.
Welcome to EdTech Speaks, a podcast where we bring guests to share their expertise and advice on navigating business and education in a technology-driven world. Our goal is to provide you with options for products, services, and knowledge that can help benefit you or your business. I'm Cher Downing, your host, and I want to introduce today's guest, Crystal Kadakia. Crystal is a two-time TEDx speaker, Power Under 30 recipient, best-selling author of The Millennial Myth, and an organizational development consultant. Welcome, Crystal.
Hi, Cher. It's so great to be here.
So, Crystal, talk to us a little bit about your background. And obviously, you've been busy in your short lifespan here and professionally. Excited to see that you're a two-time TEDx speaker. That's a very big issue in today's world. But tell us a little bit about how you got started and the directions that you're going.
Yeah, sure. So, like a lot of people in the education space, you can fall into this from so many different ways. And for me, I actually started out as a chemical engineer. I worked for 6 years for Procter & Gamble, started out in engineering, and quickly realized within the first 3 years that I really was in love with problem-solving people stuff rather than kind of the machine stuff or the process stuff that was in front of me. And so I actually switched to a training manager role at P&G and then ended up leaving to start my own business. And especially because I was seeing a lot of gaps in the space, not just in L&D, but when it comes to culture and people and the workplace, especially as digital technology came on the scene. This was back in 2011. There was a lot of talk around generational transitions. And it was very siloed. The whole discussion was very siloed. And what I noticed was people were spending a lot of time talking about the symptoms of digital, but not really addressing the root cause, which was digital. It's like digital is changing everything as we know it, not just, I'm installing a new software and I'm upgrading to the cloud. It was really changing everyone's behaviors, ways of working, corporate culture, whether we were intentionally wanting that or liking that or whatever. And so when I left P&G, I really started speaking about this. And so that's the two TEDx talks you refer to. I really started shifting people's lens from, hey, this isn't about the symptoms of you think there might be generational warfare going on or whatever. In reality, what's happening is digital is transforming things at an underlying fundamental level here. And we need to surface that and work with that complexity. And so I started out keynote speaking. I wrote The Millennial Myth. And that came out back in 2016, 2017. And since then, I now today wear two different hats. I'm an independent OD consultant working on organizational development and culture change, especially in the nonprofit sector. That's really where my passion lies, is helping nonprofits make the most of this time and really seize their potential. And then the second hat I wear is the leader of the Learning Cluster Design Group, which is specifically tailored towards the education and learning industries. And it's about a new model for designing learning that makes sense in this digital age. And again, it's because we really just, when you look at that transformation, there's all these symptoms we talk about. We need bite-sized learning. We need everyone's attention only lasts this long. Those are symptoms. The real cause is digital's fundamentally changing the way that we can learn. And we need to respond more holistically to that. And that's what the LCD group, the LCD model is all about.
This is so exciting to me on a couple of levels. As my listeners know, I always talk about that those of us that are in middle age now lived half a life with technology and half a life without. So we've seen both sides of it. We remember what it's like to live without anything beyond a TV plugging into the wall. We just didn't have the technology. But for the generations underneath us, they don't know a world without technology. And so, as you say, we've tried to silo them and we've tried to blame responsibility on when they were born to how they learn and what they do and their lack of attention and such. And I think, well, but they don't know any different. They don't understand because they've never seen it any other way. And so when you look at a child, I was in an airport recently, there's a child on an iPad just screaming through a game, playing like crazy, probably 4 years old. So for their brain, for their skill set, for their emotional understanding, as well as their technological understanding, it all made sense to them. This is how they're learning. So now applying those skills to something else, and we try to teach them in a different way, isn't working. And that's not that child's fault. It's not that generation's fault. It's that we are not adapting on the education side as quickly as we should be. And we're not adapting in the workforce either as quickly as we should be. I think you are right in there.
Yeah, 100%. It's interesting. I was just reading this about how, when you're in a time of conflict between people, you want to say that, oh, it's a personality clash. But then the only solution that you think of is, well, then you have to change your personality. Well, guess what, folks? You're not going to change anybody's personality. That's not going to happen. So not with a lot of investment, as most people in relationships know, you're not going to be changing someone's personality. So really, if you look at it from that blame lens, you're not going to get anywhere. And the truth is the world has already changed around us. It's an inevitable piece of the atmosphere. I'm known for saying you cannot go back and uninvent the internet. That's not a possibility. So when we talk about learning and learning design, we can try to stick to the core of how we've always done things and focus on our classes and courses and programs. But when you look at modern learners, and that's exactly what my colleague Lisa M.D. Owens and I did, when you look at modern learners, that's not how they're learning today. If you even think about the last time you learned something new, I don't care what generation you are, what age you are, what ethnicity you are, what any of those demographics are, if you think about the last time you learned something, you probably used a variety of different tools or resources, and you probably spread them across different times depending on your need in that moment. And so it's to say that all of our learning design skills are oriented towards designing for one moment in time, be that attending the class or watching a video, that's just so outdated. And it's not as relevant to how people are actually learning today, which is using multiple things across multiple times and places. And so that's really where we started, of fundamentally, whether you're designing for education or you're designing for the workforce, we assume our product is one thing. And we have all these great models to tell us how to design that one thing perfectly. This is curriculum design. It's the one curriculum. But folks, what if you're not designing that one curriculum? That's not really, what if we inserted a new assumption? And our new assumption is we're supposed to design multiple things across, we call those things learning assets, by the way. I'm just using things here, but you're designing multiple learning assets to achieve a particular capability gap or goal. What would our design process look like if that was our product? And that's really what the learning cluster design model is all about. And we call that new product learning clusters, because we really believe you're surrounding learners with a meaningful set of learning assets, and they get to pick and choose which one they use when, based on their context.
Well, it's interesting because I bought something new recently and it comes with a manual. All things come with a manual with a warranty and all. But it also has a scan code. I can go online and I can see the PDF right there anytime that I want. But it also has a YouTube video. So rather than me sitting and reading through the manual of how to put this product together, there's someone that's going to show me. So I'm instantly immersed in 3 different ways, whatever fits my learning style, whatever fits my time, whatever fits where I'm located. And as soon as I scanned that code in, I immediately got an email back that said, hey, we saw you use this. We have other how-tos and customer reviews over here. And I thought it was very interesting because, again, as you said, it didn't matter the demographic. What they recognized was everybody wants it in a different way. And that's why people are watching YouTube videos so much. You know, when they're trying to fix something or something doesn't work in their house, what's the first thing they do now? They go to YouTube and they watch a video rather than we used to call a repairman immediately, or we would call the source of the product. And now we're going, we can probably fix this on our own. Let's just do this. So our mindsets are changing throughout our ages. And so it's interesting that, you know, we're still struggling to bring that change allotment into the classroom. But I think also we were all forced, both on the education side and on the business side, into this immersion in 2020 when the pandemic hit. We suddenly had no choice and we had to start to come up with new and different ways. Unfortunately, not everybody did, but for a good percentage of them, it really forced the issue. And now people are saying, I don't want to go back to the old way. I want to find something that's kind of in the middle, but this clearly made more sense. So I'm sure you've seen a lot of this as you're talking to people and researching more, but what's your take on what the pandemic did for the learning cluster?
Yeah, great question. So we started developing the learning cluster design model back in 2016, and we were teaching it, we were practicing it for 5 years now. And, you know, we came out with our book last year, Designing for Modern Learning, published by ATD, the Association for Talent Development. And so we've had a lot of time to watch this evolve. And what's fascinating is before the pandemic, there were organizations that were all over this and they were already doing it. And of course, when the pandemic hit, they were in a much better place because not everything was instructor-led training, live dependent. There was another set of organizations that they dove in to switching right away, but switching for them meant everything is going from ILT to e-learning and videos. And it's like an automatic assumption that the only thing you can do when you're remote is e-learning and videos. And again, this is very limited when you think about all the technology, just even the example you just mentioned of the manual, right? You know that when you're probably going to throw that manual away and you know there's going to be a chat support available on the website of the manufacturer, right? There's a social learning possibility there that's exactly a part of that cluster as well. So it's things like that there's that second set of organizations that when they made the leap, they really just assumed that the only solution is e-learning. And then you have to deal with all the barriers of, well, e-learning's not as good as face-to-face. What happens to all the social components? And now a year and a half later, they're starting to look at, well, what are the other learning assets that are available in our digital world? And there are a lot. And so I would say that for us, there's been the more basic organization or traditional learning organization that had to be pushed to try this out. And then there's been, that they had to be pushed in the sense of they needed the forcing mechanism before they would think this way. And then there's been the more modern forward-thinking organizations that were already trying this out beforehand. And then there's the organizations that really, I would say, are honestly, very bluntly stuck in the past. They kept thinking, well, the pandemic's going to end someday. And so we're just going to suspend training right now, or we're really going to put very minimal effort to this. And I think those organizations are hurting the most because as we return to work, it's not a return to business as usual, especially when you think about the impact of the Great Resignation. A lot of that is because people don't want the rigidity of business as usual. And so the world we're coming back to, you can't force people to unsee something they've seen. similar to how you can't uninvent the internet. And it's a world of flexibility, whether corporate leaders like it or not. I've been remote since 2011. Zoom didn't even exist at that time. Mm-hmm. It's already been possible for a decade. And now everyone has seen that possibility. So what are you going to do? Put the rabbit back in the hat? You can't.
Exactly.
So I think the pandemic has been I've been saying this, like the silver lining of the pandemic is it has been such a great forcing mechanism for things I've been working on for a decade, which is digital workplace culture is here. You can't uninvent it. You need to embrace it and change and make the most of that change. And what I'm seeing is there's organizations that they resist, and they're the furthest behind. And they're having the biggest talent problems, and they're having the biggest resignations happen. And I'm not here to say shame on you or anything like that, but everyone's choices have consequences. And if that's your strategic lens, is to wait until you're forced, then there's going to be consequences to that. And so I think it's really important for leaders to really take notice of this kind of disruption. Because if there's anything we've learned in the 2000s is we live in a time of disruptions are coming. You don't know. The pandemic was completely unexpected. So if you're just going to keep waiting and waiting, sorry, another disruption is probably going to come and ruin your stability, and if that's the strategic lens you want to keep on moving with, go for it. That's fine. It's your prerogative.
Exactly. And there are some countries that are going back, what we call back under. They're shuttering down again because the variants are kicking in. We're seeing waves of it in different locations. And so, yes, the changeover for them, if they were prepared, is minimal. But if you resisted the first time and now you have a second go around, it's going to decimate some of those businesses for the wrong reason. Not because of their product, not because of, their success, but because of their inability to be flexible. I think one of the most interesting things, and I've not seen data on it yet, but I think clearly there's also a demographic in the sense of those who are running companies who are older and have that hard and fast rule of, if you're in the office, I know you're working. And we've seen that for years. I've always found it interesting because once we got computers, I can walk by your office, but you're behind a screen. I don't know if you're watching cat videos unless I, happen to walk into your office and look to see what you're doing. But I think for a long time now, maybe for the last 10 years, there's been an assumption that because there's a computer in front of you, you're actually doing something. We've not tied that correlated that to productivity. We've just said, well, if you're in 8 hours a day, you must be doing something. If you're at home for 8 hours a day, you won't be doing anything. And we were shocked to find out that productivity went up during the pandemic. We were shocked to find out that meetings could still be held and were actually sometimes even better, particularly when we had global team members. We were shocked to find out that, wow, we can access everything from remote locations and people are willing to work more because they don't have to clock out and drive home. They'll just go ahead and finish that project. And so it's been interesting to me that we had such a learning curve from the pandemic, but so many are still resistant to it. And as you said, people aren't wanting to go back to that. They've understood now that they can have a better work-life balance. They've understood that there's more opportunities for them to do things. The companies that I see that are doing really well are thinking also outside the box in terms of what kind of training can we give you? What kind of teaching can we offer you that goes in addition to you working remotely? How do we support you better being a remote employee? And so I see, that learning carrying across because I think it's horizontal as well as vertical. People are moving to companies not just because they let you work remote, but because of the benefits that are tied to it and the appreciation for you being a remote worker. And that's another piece of it that's just not really being recognized. So I find it's fascinating to me to see how all of this is coming together. What are you seeing in the training aspect of it? Are people thinking through learning design model and pulling that into their new training, or is there revamping their old training? Is there an embrace to also think about the outcomes in terms of what their employees are learning?
Yeah, absolutely. All of those things. So I often like to say that you can have the right technology, but if you don't have the right thinking to go alongside it, you're not going to be able to make the most of that technology. And we see that all the time. We see people investing in new learning management systems or learning platforms to deliver the learning. But because they're still stuck in this one and done curriculum design model, they're not able to leverage that technology to the fullest of its capabilities. A lot of the new LMSs, a lot of the new learning platforms, a lot of the new amazing new learning asset tools that are out there, they're really centering on things like social learning, immediate learning, things that are 24/7 available, things that help you learn through others, not just the facilitator or the teacher or the educator. And those are all things historically we don't know how to design in. We don't have a model that helps us think through that. So what we see with learning cluster design is, because we're fundamentally addressing this gap of, instead of one and done, we're developing a learning cluster, we actually are able to coach and guide and teach people how you can design learning that makes the most of all the different tools that are out there. Because a lot of the tools interface with people not in the L&D controlled way or the educator controlled way, but it's asynchronous. It's whenever the learner wants it and needs it. And it's how do you design for a self-directed world? So what we often see is people will come to us with an initial initiative that either they have an existing course that's outdated, but it's business critical, and they want to figure out, how do we make this more impactful? How do we actually make it so this is going to have an on-the-job change or a capability change at the end of it? And because we're designing multiple learning assets from that one beginning source, we have greater confidence that we'll see the change at the end, whatever that end might be, however we define that with the client. So there's two things we do. One is that we upskill people in the learning cluster design model so they can go and do this themselves. Our goal is for this to really be the norm, is people designing learning clusters instead of classes and courses. So we offer a 2-week practicum that really helps people deep dive into this. And we have actually our own learning cluster for learning cluster design. So there's that, the 2-week practicum is one way, but we have a lot of different ways people can grow their capability in the model. And then the second way we work with folks is really on a particular project that they have, and we'll work alongside them, teaching them the model as we go and delivering that win for their organization. Again, whether it's higher ed, whether it's in a corporate space, whether it's a nonprofit space, government, it's very industry agnostic, the model. And we've actually found a lot of different roles that are unexpected using the model. So we actually have a lot of sales and marketing folks, a lot of customer education folks who have found the model useful, who are trying to educate customers on a product that their company sells. We have people who are selling off-the-shelf training solutions, now reconfiguring their entire business model. Instead of selling their customers an e-learning for diversity, equity, inclusion, for example, they are looking at how can we give them a set of learning assets that's more likely to impact their DEI goals. Because, how are you going to build DEI capability through one e-learning? Right? That's a very tough confidence to have.
Well, and what it usually ends up being is it's a report that says we have 100 employees and 99% completed the model.
Exactly. And
you pat yourself on the back for having it accomplished, your D&I training, and it hasn't changed your culture one iota. But you feel in the HR space that, you check mark, you've moved on to something else.
You did your job, right? Which is, and that's very superficial. I mean, if you take that same example and you've built a learning cluster, you might have the e-learning, you might still have the e-learning, which is great and fantastic to build the foundation. But then you might also have a series of job aids for what to do when you run into specific situations that target audience is going to run into. You might have coaching that's offered as a part of this. You might have in the moment resources that they can go to when they're struggling and they run into that kind of problem. So there's a bunch of different kinds of assets you might deliver for that same challenge. And I always ask people, well, what are you going to have more confidence is going to make a difference at the end of the day? That one e-learning or this package of learning assets that the learner themselves chooses what's going to work for them in the moment that they need it. And we design that set of assets very tailored based on understanding the learner personas, understanding the change you'd like to see on the job, those sorts of questions. Versus we tend to take this kind of peanut butter approach with our content right now of, well, here's all the great content we have. Let me just cram it all into one course and hope it makes a difference. That's all going away with the learning cluster design model.
Well, and I think over the years in the places that I've worked and the trainings that I've had, been required to do, or they've been provided as optional training and such, many of these assets that you talk about, they already have. They have them on the shelf. They have them there. What they need is to be updated or tweaked, or they need to be fed in a way that makes sense with everything else that's being done instead of everything being siloed. It's just this month we do this, next month we do that. You don't realize that there's a correlation and there's an application that they fit together. I think the other piece of it is, in thinking through, suddenly when you do a learning cluster, your audience is the same level. We've always built to you're a new employee, to your returning employee, to your senior employee. And somewhere along the line, someone comes in and gets miscategorized or gets elevated because of years of experience. And so they miss out on pieces. I've seen this time and time again. And then it's very hard to get them to go back and say, oh, well, now you need to go back and do orientation. Now you need to go back and do, these intro models. And people say, well, I don't want to do that. I've already been here for 3 years. I'm not doing that. And so I see the learning cluster as just welcoming everyone wherever they're at that point in time and moving them all progressively forward across the board, which is ideally what you want.
100%. And it's a really excellent point you bring up, because we also look at target audience very differently, because there's often that very clear-cut siloed demographic approach to defining target audience. Like, yeah, you're a new hire. And by and large, most of our training programs often are dedicated towards people learning things the first time and learning things as new hires, and then, or a new manager. And that's it. And then it's like, well, what about everybody else, where they're at in their journey? And also, how does that really tie into the context they're in and what kinds of learning assets they're going to be using, most likely to be using? And so that's really, we have a learner persona approach that's actually pretty different from design thinking, from Agile for Learning. What we really focus on with our learner personas is looking at flow of work and also their relationship to the capability gap. So a good example is when we talk about remote working, for example, we were recently talking about what team building would look like, a team building, training or L&D initiative would look like. And originally, folks had put together a set of team building activities like check-ins that folks could do at the beginning of team meetings. So no strategy really behind this. Like, why was that the particular content and tool chosen? But anyway, as we started diving more into it, we're thinking about who are the different personas involved with remote work. Well, in this case, we know that there's some people who have families at home. We know there's some people who are actually returning to the office part-time during the week. And these are different personas. Those aren't normal demographics you would consider, but they have a different relationship to the capability gap. We have project manager roles who are actually leading those team meetings. And so when you think about where everyone's sitting in both their context and their relationship to the capability, now you have a totally different understanding of your audience that leads to different learning assets. The person who's leading the team meeting is probably going to have different team building learning assets than someone who's going into the office half the time and coming back. Like, the person who's going in the office half the time might have some really great headquarter type or in-person type knowledge they could bring back to the team to help with team building. And so those are the kinds of things that we started looking at in terms of content and also the delivery method. So that's the kinds of things when you talk about personas versus your normal new hire, new manager, as they graduate from one level to the next, what are we giving them? There's so many other ways to slice and dice learners than the way we do today.
And I think, that sentence is ultimately it. It's not about if they're in school. It's not about if they're working. It's not about if they're learning a new hobby or trade. It's about there's different ways to make people learn. I mean, it's just that's as simplistic as it is.
And it's not learning styles either, right? It's just it might be in a literal different home environment. It could be a different context. They could have a different moment of learning need. If you're not familiar with moment of learning need, Mosher and Gottfriedsen's model, the 5 moments of learning need gets into that. Are you learning the first time? Are you learning more? Are you learning when you hit a problem? Are you learning when things change? What is that moment? It has nothing to do with, again, learning style. That's the same thing. It's like saying, well, I'm going to change your personality. I'm going to change your learning style. I'm not a big proponent of learning styles, if you can't tell. But I think context, again, regardless of age, generation, ethnicity, gender, whatever, your context matters a lot, and it dictates how you choose to learn in a particular moment. So for many years, we've never taken context into account in our designs. Yeah. And why? Because our goal has been to design one thing. If you're designing one curriculum, you don't have any space to take into account all these different contexts, because at the end of the day, you're designing something that's one size fits all.
And it's interesting to me because I'm always thinking of it in education as chicken and egg, which is we build to be accredited so that we, have the mark of excellence. We're publicly announced that we are on track. We are doing what we're supposed to be doing. And so we often build to meet the need of getting that, because that is important. That's what people look for, is quality and stability and continuity. At the same time, we build to that, and then we're not building based on our audience. And so I think oftentimes accreditation hasn't moved forward as quickly as it should either. And, I think about when we really started getting heavy into e-learning, and accreditation was just like, oh no, you can't possibly offer these courses online. They have to be on the campuses. And then we started offering them, and you still have to have seat time. It's like, well, why do I have to have seat time if someone's sitting at their house doing this course? Why should it matter that they sit on their couch 3 hours on Tuesday night? It shouldn't. And so then we got, past that hurdle, but we still have that. It needs to match what we're doing on campus. And I keep saying, it can't and it shouldn't. And we shouldn't be worried about that piece of it. We should be worried about what our learner outcomes are and the best way to deliver it to them. So I think oftentimes, and on the business side too, there's always a governing body that's kind of holding us back from aligning and doing what we really would know would be best, because we want to have that consistency. But what it does is it impacts then the individuals.
Yeah. And frankly, it causes you to design for the lowest common denominator of just, what's the bare minimum we need to be doing to, with accreditation. The analogy in the business world is compliance trainings, right? We're doing it for compliance. And so, well, if you're doing it to meet a legal requirement or you're doing it for accreditation, what you're going to make sure happens is the bare minimum, which the bare minimum in legal requirements is that people have read and acknowledged that they understood something. With accreditation, it's that they can pass the test. So all of our efforts are going to go towards meeting that bare minimum. And yet that bare minimum doesn't have to do with the actual change happening that we want to see. And so I think what you're getting at is something really important too, which is, are these governing bodies, are leaders who are entrenched in maybe traditional ways, are they asking the right questions to begin with? Is the right question, how are we matching new experiences to old experiences? Is that the right question to be asking? Or is the right question to be asking, what's going to get us to the outcomes we want? The outcomes in an accreditation are fantastic outcomes. You do want people to have that quality outcome that an accreditation outlines. But if we're asking the question, well, I want to get there in the same way I used to get there, how do I do that? That's a totally different question than just continuing to reorient on the accreditation outcomes themselves. How can I get there today? Forget about where you were at the past. When you try to keep comparing to the past and making that be your defining standard for today, you're missing out on all the opportunities of what today's technology could offer you. I mean, it's actually possible that what you do online or virtually could even be better than what you had, especially if you are doing things in combination. So you could have the live, you could have virtual support with it. You could have peer-to-peer support. You could have crowdsourced, learner-sourced, student-sourced learning as a part of it, where they're really making some of these accreditation outcomes their own. There's so much that technology can handle that one teacher could not handle in the front of the class, right? And technology helps you do that. So I think what you're getting at is something really important, and it's something that I've seen a lot, and it happens often. And it's just that we're asking the wrong questions. You go where you put your focus. And if you're asking the wrong questions, the moment you form a question, your eye starts towards the solution. And if the question you're asking is, yeah, how do we do this the same way we did it before? How do we get the exact same experience? Okay, well, now your solution starts to form, and you're going to constantly feel disappointed because things are different. It's kind of an obvious conversation to me. It's like, well, they're not the same. So, okay, exactly. They're not the same. They're not going to be the same. But so why are we having that question in the first place? The question about the outcomes, however, now that's something we can really work with. And let's talk about that.
Yeah. So one of the things that's always been interesting to me that we're still talking about it in this day and age is with online learning. And people will still say, even during the pandemic, well, we can't move that online. It has to be in person. And my response always is, the delivery method is secondary. That's not the important piece here. The important piece is the content and how we mirror or make that feeling of still being inclusive. How we deliver it, it's just an item. And once I get people past that idea, then they really open up and they're like, oh, we could have a chat room. Oh, we could have a happy hour on Zoom. And they start to go into all these different things. But it's like immediately that barrier is, well, I only know how to do this in the corporate training room. I only knew how to do this in the classroom. I couldn't possibly move this group activity into the online environment. And it's got to be an if situation. And I'm like, no, it doesn't have to be. Talk to me about your ultimate dream, your ultimate goal of what this would look like. And then let's figure out what are the tools and technology we need to make that happen so that we can, recreate it or even do something that's better in a different way. So we still very much get stuck on that initial piece of delivery. And this is how we've always done it. I know that's written in stone somewhere on every campus, in the world. And in many corporations too. We've always done it this way. It's always worked for us. We're not going to change it. We're not going to change our measurements because suddenly our data will be skewed. And I'm like, but your data was already skewed because you only measured 3 things out of 25. So you only gave us a snapshot of what you wanted us to see. Doesn't matter. If you really want to be transparent and show everything, you're already in a skewed area. So now let's really work towards getting you where you need to be. So I think you're bringing this learning cluster into everyone is just phenomenal because I think it's really supporting not only change for learning, but change in methodology across the board. Because I suspect that people that see the success of this with their training or with their particular demographic of employee are also going to start to see ways it will work in other locations, either within their school, their institution, or within their company.
And I know 100%, I've been talking a lot about the business side of things, but we have folks who are teaching high school classes who are applying the learning cluster model. And they're finding it alleviates the pressure on them as the educator because they're able to really harness social learning and peer-to-peer learning and immediate learning. So that way it's not all reliant on the teacher being the sage on the stage all the time. And they're finding that technology works well with generations that have grown up with technology. So, Snapchatting and Instagramming and all of that types of tools, it comes really naturally. So I think that there's things where people will say that things are not possible. And I can always look around and say it's already been done. So, one of the things that really strikes me is when people think it's impossible to have global relationships, for example. And that was before the pandemic. Talking about relationships across borders is like, oh, it's so hard and this and that. Well, you know what? People have been immigrating to the US for years and years and years. And back when my parents immigrated, they kept in touch with their family thousands of miles away once a month through aerograms, like the little blue letters that you mail internationally, and you wait like 2 weeks before you hear a response back. You know what? They kept in touch with their family that whole time with these aerograms. And today it's on WhatsApp, and I'm able to reach my cousins. We can do a video call anytime we want. So for anyone to say that something isn't possible, it's more that it's not possible in their worldview. And they just need to break out of their worldview. And that's what a lot of what you're saying is, hey, we focused so much on the what and the how we do things, and we've gotten locked into this one worldview of how we do things, when really we need to back up and keep looking at the why and what we're trying to achieve, and then figure out our hows. Because guess what? Someone somewhere out there is doing that how. And I guarantee you, if you don't think you can come up with an answer for that, somebody else can help you. And it's okay to embrace breaking out of your worldview. I think that's something to be applauded. And sometimes people really give themselves the pat on the back for being the expert all the time. And that's exhausting. It's exhausting to be the expert all the time, especially when you find out that the world is kind of moving on and you're getting hit with all these disruptions, and you can still sound like the expert, but you can look at your outcomes and see it not quite line up. And I think that can be very defeating. And I often really seek to empower leaders of, it's okay. It's okay to change your worldview. It's okay to expand it. There's actually something very inspiring about that to your people. And so maybe letting go of a little bit of that resistance is actually just what you need during what's now basically going to be a 2-year long pandemic situation.
Absolutely. And, surrounding yourself with good people. So many that get in those executive positions feel like the world weighs on their shoulders. And when they bring in people who are open to doing new things and trying these new things, if they allow them to do that, it's amazing the outcomes. And some of the greatest CEOs that we've had in history have talked about the fact that they don't have all the answers. They're smart enough to hire the people that do. And that's a tribute to them as well, to be humble enough to say, I don't know everything, and I'm not going to pretend I know everything, but I am going to bring in the right people to make this company the best that it can be. And we're going to express our support of our employees because we want to keep our talent, and we want to figure out better ways to do that. And I think, this is truly proven who's really supportive of their employees and who's really supportive of change. And so the next 1 to 2 years, I think, is going to be very, very interesting.
I agree. And this is something I talked a lot about in the Millennial Myth. And for anyone who finds themselves in that space of resistance, I really would recommend picking up the Millennial Myth. It goes through the 5 biggest myths people have about millennials, like they're lazy, they're entitled, and so on. And one of the things I say in there that I think is so important is to know that all this focus on well-being and flexibility and purposeful work, meaningful work, it benefits you too as a leader. It's probably stuff you've wanted for a really long time.
Yep.
And guess what? Now it's possible. And you can stay on the bitter bus forever that it wasn't there for you. But is that really what you want? is it really what you want for people to have to put in the time that you did? And, do you really want to lead and manage from that place of bitterness? Or do you want everyone, including yourself, to be able to take advantage of what the world today has to offer, which is greater flexibility? It is being able to figure out a better balance between family and work. It is able to have a more integrated picture of that. And you can see your grandchildren too. You don't have to have the butts in seats mentality for yourself too. And that's a really wonderful thing. You know when you're working, when you're being productive. And oh, by the way, when you saw people in the office live, you never really knew if anyone was being productive or not. It's an illusion of control. And again, it's that the question you wanted to be asking is, are they at their seat? Or did you want to be asking, are we making a difference to our goals and our mission? I think it's really important to know, again, that you can change your worldview too, and that all of this benefits you. It's not just for the benefit of the organization. Leaders don't need to be as burned out and fatigued as they are today either.
And the piece that has not been highlighted near enough, I don't think, over the past year and a half is the sudden access to really a phenomenal talent, because they no longer have to be sitting in front of you. The person that didn't want to apply for your job because they don't want to relocate across country or to a new country suddenly is on your payroll doing fantastic things, creating amazing products, and doing the very things that you've been dreaming about having done, but they're just not sitting in your building. The access to talent has just been just incredible. And so the people that are embracing it are getting the best of the best and not having to worry about that they're sitting there.
100%. And it's funny to me that I was just looking at the latest Fortune Deloitte report on CEOs' concerns. And the number one thing is labor skills shortage. It's like 73 or 70% of CEOs are worried about labor skills shortage. That's the main thing they're concerned about. And you got to keep breaking out of your normal talent pools. You got to keep looking at what's out there, and you have to be willing to build people's capability. I think there's a huge expectation that people come ready-made to deal with the complexity we have. And yet here we are, this is where all the pieces start tying in, right? We're talking about learning and development here, and we're talking about higher education, and those industries are in the midst of evolving. So to expect people to come out of those institutions and be ready-made to handle the complexity we have today, and it's unrealistic. So we do need to beef up our L&D department skills. We do need higher education to evolve. We do need them to think about how to really build capability beyond just passing the test or meeting our legal requirements. And then we need to invest in recruiting people from everywhere and take the time to actually allow them to grow and not hold ourselves to the standard of figuring out the complexity tomorrow, because it's not going to happen. If you're an executive leader, you're feeling this pressure of figuring it all out. And I know that, of course, there's shareholder goals and all of those kinds of things that are very real and pressing. But it's also, I think it's very important that we see that we're in the midst of a journey right now. We're not at the end of a long, stable time period, and things are still just continuing to be stable. We've got to be honest with ourselves. Things have been disrupted for a really long time now. I mean, almost 2 decades. And we're on a journey with evolving and adapting to that disruption. No one is coming ready-made. Executives down to your new hires, down to college students, to high school students. We're all disrupting together. We're all in this transition time together, whether it's the last 2 years or the last 20 years. We're all evolving.
Absolutely. So, Crystal, this has been fantastic to talk about today. And I think it's so relevant across the board to businesses, to corporations, to K through 12 and higher ed. How do our listeners find more information out on your learning cluster and also on how to reach out to you?
Yeah, so if you're hearing me on the podcast, really encourage you to connect with me on LinkedIn. I know I talked both about my OD work as well as the LCD model. if you're interested in either, LinkedIn is the best way to get in touch with me. I respond personally to everyone. It's my profile. It's my baby. So you can always reach me there. And if you're particularly interested in the model, I highly recommend checking out our book, Designing for Modern Learning, and also our website, www.learningclusterdesign.com.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I so appreciate it. Thank you to all our listeners out there. Please remember that we will provide all of those links and information on whichever site you go to for your podcasts. We're available on Spotify, Audible, Apple, iHeartRadio, Google, Acast, and Stitcher. Thank you all for joining us here today. And to all of our listeners, keep learning.
Thank you for listening to EdTech Speaks with EdTech strategist Cher Downing. To learn more about the services Downing EdTech and its staff can provide you, find us at www.downingedtech.com. If you enjoyed today's podcast, be sure to share it. We'd also like to hear from you regarding any suggestions for topics or guests and the value you received from our show. Check back for new podcasts with featured guests at www.downingedtech.com/podcast.